Well, we returned to our text in 1 Corinthians, and we skipped over, we did our couple of Christmas messages, and one of the main reasons was because the text that we arrived at was a little bit of a challenging text. And the reason is because it has to do with sexuality in the world and in our marriage, in our lives. And so kind of a challenging text. In fact, I find that two things happen when I preach on sex, and when people know I'm preaching on sex. Two things happen. One is there's some people who never come back. That has happened. And the other thing is that it becomes the most viewed message on YouTube that we have. Those two things both are generally what happens when you preach on this topic. And so kind of a challenging topic, and maybe we're tempted to kind of dance around it, skip over it, maybe even, okay, we'll keep this for Wednesday night when we don't have to worry about a mixed crowd. But I think it's relevant, it's important, it's critical that we cover all aspects of the Word of God, that it all is important and valuable to us. And so especially as we look at this today, we consider this. This was written to a people in Corinth that were saturated in, or they were living in a sex-saturated society. Everything around them had to do with that. Sexual immorality, sexual depravity, all the things were prevalent in their culture. And so that is why this message was necessary to be delivered by Paul to the people in Corinth. But I don't know that I even have to say it, but we also live in a very sex-saturated society. We live in a time of sexual depravity, and so if that message was necessary to the church in Corinth, it's necessary to the church at Crossview. It's necessary to the church today. And so it's one of the great reasons, as I've shared, that we go through the text passage by passage, verse by verse, because these would be the kind of passages that we would probably skip around. But when we walk through the Bible, verse by verse, we aren't given that opportunity. And so today we're going to look at this message on two really critical topics, kind of two general topics that he covers here that you're going to see they relate to one another. One has to do with this: should I get married? And maybe there's some of you today that are wondering that. Should I get married? Maybe you even think, I'd like to be married someday. And so the question is, from God's perspective, should I get married? That's going to be one of the things we look at today. The second thing has to do with the physical relationship of the marriage. And what are your responsibilities, if I can call it this way, what are your duties in regards to physical love within the relationship, sexual intimacy within your marriage? And so we're going to look at those 2 points today. About 6-8 weeks ago, I'm not sure the time frame now, our Facebook page, the church's Facebook page, was hacked. It was taken over by somebody else, and not even sure the purpose of all that. But I've learned this as we've tried. Tom Duvall has put so much time in to try to get our page back to no avail. But I've learned this: there's a lot of things you can't say and you can't do on Facebook. There's a lot of things that'll get you in Facebook jail. But one thing it isn't, that won't get you in trouble, is to hack, to steal somebody else's page and their material. They won't put a lot of effort into getting that back for you. And so we finally got to a place where we just had to kind of resign ourselves that this is no longer our page, even though it's got videos and pictures of ministry over the years. This now belongs to somebody else. And that other person, the immediate thing they did when they took over the page was they changed the name to Lover's Point. Of all things, our church now, Lover's Point. So we fought that, we battled against it, but now I think it's perfectly timed with today's message. We're going to formally embrace the name Lover's Point as the new name for Crossview. It's a joke. Please don't put that on our stationery. But it was funny, the day that happened, the first message I got was from my daughter Danny. She said, hey, either your Facebook page has been hacked, or that is a bold name change move you got there. So anyway, today we're going to look at sexuality and marriage. So from Lover's Point, here comes the message today. So 1 Corinthians chapter 7, we're going to look at 9 verses today. And it says this, now, concerning the matters about which you wrote. Now, let's remember the book of Corinthians. So somebody wrote to Paul about the problems that existed in Corinth. And for the first 6 chapters of the book of Corinthians, he's been talking about that. All the division, all the problems that we've been looking at over these last few months were as a result of those complaints, those concerns that were lodged with Paul from somebody else in the church. But it turns out, as we get to chapter 7, that we find out that not only that the church of Corinth also wrote a letter to Paul with some questions, some concerns that they had. This is not the leadership concerned about division. This is the church itself writing with some questions. I have some questions for you, Paul. And so from chapter 7 through, I think, about chapter 11 or so, we're going to kind of address those things that the church questioned Paul about. This is the first thing. And remember, we're, as we said, we're looking at a culture that is saturated in sex, and so the questions are going to in some way relate to that here, at least initially. So Paul says, now concerning the matters about which you wrote. Now, we don't have a copy of that. We only know because Paul said that they wrote, and these are the things that they wrote about. But here's what he says. He says, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. So boom, he gets right to the point. It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And then he gets to what really is at the heart of this. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. And so the question that really is going to emerge from this is that there were people who were not married and people who were married, but people who were not married, and the question was, is it okay if I have sexual relations outside of marriage? Is that okay? What is my responsibility if I'm married in terms of sexual intimacy? And so this emerges as the question, and really what we're going to see is they're wanting to know, should I get married? Should I not get married? Now, for the majority of you today, you've already made that decision, and so you're committed to that decision. But there are a couple people here today who have not made that decision, who are not married today. I hope this is true. I hope that God's Word is going to walk you through this and help you to come to an understanding, or to give you a path to kind of figure out, am I supposed to be married? God, do you have somebody planned for me in terms of marriage? And so verse 3, the husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. So conjugal rights, that's sexual intimacy. And he's saying that you as a husband and you as a wife have an obligation to that, to your spouse. There's a duty in that regard. And he goes on to say this. For the wife does not have authority over her own husband, or her own body, but the husband does. So the guys are sitting there, they're going, yes, right? I've been waiting for this. And I am going to put that on the refrigerator when we get home today. And so that you think, well, wait a second. So I as the husband get to determine when we have physical relations? And then he drops the disappointment on you guys. He says this. He says, likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. And so that throws us into this kind of conundrum. Wait a second, if I have authority and she has authority, then does anybody have authority? Who gets to make the call in this case? And we're going to work through that and I think come to a good understanding of it. And he says this, do not deprive one another except perhaps by agreement for a limited time that you may devote yourselves to prayer, but then come together again so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. And so he puts out there that there is the possibility that you could take some time off, that there could be a sabbatical of sorts when it comes to your physical intimacy with your spouse. But he lays out a couple of requirements for that. That is okay, but limited to these situations. And we'll look at that in just a minute. He says this, now, as a concession, not a command, I say this. I wish that all were as I myself am, but each has his own gift from God, one of one kind and one of another. What's he talking about? He's talking about singleness. He's saying, I wish you were all like me. That's Paul, single. And we're going to look at why would he say that? What's the advantage? Does that mean that singleness is better than marriage? Or that marriage is better than singleness? Which one is superior? Because Paul's saying, you know what? If I had the choice, I would choose that we would be single. Now, obviously, there would be problems if that was the case in the church. If all of us made that commitment and that decision. Why? So we can commit ourselves to ministry. And so we are all going to be single. Obviously, our church wouldn't exist very long. I mean, if you were here the first service, or here last week maybe even, the stage is full of kids. Why? Because you're married. Because you're having kids. And that's a great way of evangelism. That's a great way of growing the church. And so he's saying that for us, as we consider whether we're going to be married or single, there's some advantages to both of those things. And we need to evaluate that. And if you're not married today, consider that as you look forward in your life. He says this, verse 8, to the unmarried and the widows I say that it is good for them to remain single as I am. And we'll look at why that is. But if they cannot exercise self-control, they should marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion.